Georgia 50, LSU 30. It was indeed a Sarah McLachlan special. If you're new to the show, even if you've ever seen those pet abuse commercials, I kind of think you understand what a Sarah McLachlan special is. Just sad, somber music, reflective music. If we had the rights to it, I would play it right now. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong in the first half for LSU. Probably wouldn't have mattered, but it did matter. I mean, shockingly, LSU outgained Georgia in this game and still lost by 20. 50 points is the most ever scored by the Eastern Division team in an SEC championship game. I got a padlock stat for you real quick, and then I got several points to make. Rushing yardage. I show up to your door Friday. Hello, I have a stat for you for tomorrow's game. 274-47, Georgia will outrush LSU. You leave that conversation knowing Georgia's going to win the SEC championship. That's what a padlock stat is. Why is this a big deal? I can't believe I'm asking the question, but I have to. Somebody told me this game was meaningless. You know, someone out there, casual in nature though they are, somebody told me this game's meaningless. Someone in my family, by the way, told me this game was meaningless. I asked why, and they said, well, LSU couldn't make the playoff regardless, and Georgia could make the playoff regardless. Shh, again. That's how we're handling casuals in 2023. Don't make physical contact. That's a lawsuit. But come as close as you can with your index finger to those lips and just shh. It's Saturday. It's the first Saturday in December. It's time to talk about the SEC championship, not the playoff. And see, here is one misnomer. As we were walking on the field after the game, I had someone who works at the stadium say, man, this is kind of getting old hat for Georgia, isn't it? I said, what's that? SEC championship, man, they seem to win it every year. They haven't won it since 2017. What are we even talking about right now? This is not old hat at all. The last time they won the SEC championship was the same year, by the way, that they ended up getting beat by Tua in the national title. That's a little while ago, just as a frame of reference there. This team hasn't done this in a while. They've gotten there a couple of times. They haven't won it since 2017. You know why? Because it's hard to win it, which makes it a meaningful game, not a meaningless game. Don't let people who think the sport begins and ends with the playoff tell you otherwise. That's a big deal. Secondly, I want to talk to you about Stetson Bennett. I have long since apologized for my stance on Stetson Bennett, and I'm not going to sit here and continue beating myself over the head about this. I want to talk to you about a calendar, and I want you to flip it back to last year. You watched Stetson Bennett last night, player of the game, but I want you to flip back to last year. I'll tell you why this game's so important. How well do you remember last Christmas, last December? How well do you remember it? If you live in the state of Georgia especially, how well do you remember it? Because there's a little revisionist history going on that suggests, oh, Stetson Bennett's been rolling with that team. No, he hadn't. No, he hadn't. This time last year, they were licking their wounds because they had gotten beat by Alabama soundly. And the talking point was not only we got little shot now that we can't beat Alabama. This time last year, Georgia had just gotten beaten soundly by Bama in the SEC championship game, and the rest of December, the entire month, was spent around the state of Georgia and the Georgia fan base asking, is Kirby Smart going to start JT Daniels in the playoff? Because if he doesn't, we have no shot. We've seen what Stetson can do. He's not good enough. We got to try it with JT Daniels. Kirby never flinched, to his credit, because he knew what he had in both guys. And he knew that one game does not define a guy. Sure enough, they played the exact same team a month later, and largely because of Stetson Bennett, they won that game. But see, people forget that. A lot of his harshest critics, they've forgotten that now. I swear to you, I count dozens of people who are praising him now and dare to wag their finger at anyone who doesn't praise him, who were counting him out and who were touting JT Daniels as the guy who should start in the playoff for Georgia last year. People forget it because they're winning now, and they've already won a national championship, and they're the favorite to win another one. It hasn't been that way. It hasn't been easy at all. This hasn't been smooth sailing. It was extremely rocky just one calendar year ago. So that's why it's a big deal. They won the SEC, Stetson Bennett did it, and now they're the favorite in the playoff. It hasn't been smooth. It's been very, very bumpy. Now, the other thing to keep in mind as you're looking at this, and you take away with every other game that you watch, is when teams win a national title, naturally there's a big spotlight on them. And I think I heard a lot over this summer I heard a lot of notions about how Georgia wasn't going to be able to do fill in the blank this year, and how they lost a lot of guys to the draft, and Alabama was going to be really good, and I believe Bama was going to be the best team in the conference. But I certainly remember Georgia losing a lot of guys in the draft, but I remember people just making these definitive statements. And you got to be careful with the definitives, because you get fooled into thinking because a team is not as good as last year in your mind, that means they can't accomplish the same end result that that team did. But that's only true if they don't measure up to the other teams around them. It's not about whether Georgia's as good as they were last year. It's about whether they're better than all the other teams around them in calendar year 2022. This year they have been. You could argue that's because the sport's down or whatever you want to. That's not their fault. They're just playing their best ball right now, and they are reaping the rewards. They're a 1 seed yet again. But spring and summer benefited them greatly, and I'm going to tell you why. You're supposed to be dealing with a lot of complacency right now. Georgia's not supposed to be in the position they're in. You're supposed to be dealing with guys struggling to rev their engines internally to the degree they did a year ago. You're supposed to be struggling maybe even with parts of your staff, and you're supposed to be struggling with folks being fat and happy because they did something they hadn't done in a couple of generations, and they're not dealing with it. Georgia's not dealing with it, at least to the degree that we can see. I'm not saying there haven't been days where Kirby's not had to jump down someone's throat for it. I'm saying, on the whole, that program looks every bit as hungry as they did last year. And I'll tell you 2 reasons I think have contributed to that. Number one, they lost so many guys, something that people told you would make them weaker. They lost so many guys to the draft. A lot of the ones you see playing critical roles for this team now were not starters last year. Therefore, they don't have the sense of entitlement that typically would come if you had already started and won a title. A lot of these guys have had it preached to them over and over again, you haven't proven a thing. And that's true. That's not a mind game. The other thing is there was so much going on off the field in college football in the winter and spring and summer, no one had time to talk about Georgia. I mentioned this over the summer. Said, for a team that just won a title for the first time in 40 years, there sure hadn't been a lot of talk about him on this show or elsewhere. And it wasn't because they're a no-name team. It's just because so much was happening. Playoff talk, portal talk, NIL talk. The sport seemed to blow up every week. Georgia kind of flew under the radar. So they didn't get praised like you normally would. They don't have a huge chunk of a returning national championship team like you normally would. There's very little complacency. They just haven't had to deal with it. And it's refreshing to see. I guarantee you Kirby Smart loves it. Some thoughts on LSU here right quick. I think last night's going to pay dividends and pay dividends immediately, because I think you finally saw what a lot of us speculated you may have in Garrett Nussmeier. I'm one who thought he may start for them from the opening gun. It ended up being Jaden Daniels. Jaden Daniels had a great year for them. They're in the SEC championship game, in large part because of him. But last night you saw Garrett Nussmeier get pressed into action. Now I understand it's a big difference when you face a team and you're already trailing and you're in nothing to lose, just throw it against the wall mentality, and that team hasn't prepared for you. I understand there's a difference between that and being the full-time starting quarterback. I think Garrett Nussmeier is fully capable of being the full-time starting quarterback at LSU. Now we enter a very critical stretch, because there's a lot of division, not toxic division, but there's a lot of healthy division amongst LSU fans as to what they think is going to happen. Some people thought Nussmeier was going to go in the portal because up until last night, it kind of looked like Jaden Daniels' team, and then surely he'll be the starter next year. And now all of a sudden you see what Nussmeier can do, and you're like, wait, if we build the offense around him, if we fortify the offensive line, which is priority A, if we continue to build at the running back and receiver positions, and we got Nussmeier back there, might our ceiling be higher with him? I think the answer is yes. Like, I'm of that opinion. Without having to knock Jaden Daniels, I'm of that opinion. Well, you know the transfer portal window opens tomorrow. And that's what you have to keep an eye on. No one knows what's going to happen here. I don't even think the LSU staff has a firm grip on what's going to happen here. Selfishly, I want to see what he can do. I want to see what Garrett Nussmeier can do in an entire season down there. And I also think that if you were to take that film, if you're Brian Kelly and Mike Denbrock and that staff, and you were to say, this is the future of LSU football, next year and the year after, this is the future, boy, I can go fishing for some big perimeter skill talent in the transfer portal. And I've got a really good recruiting class coming in. I'm not saying the portal's the end-all, be-all. I think you can you can be right back in the conversation again next year and years to come. This was ahead of schedule. It just so happened the West was a little bit down, and LSU was opportunistic enough to beat Alabama, and good for them. It's not a bad thing they got blown out. It's a good thing they were there to begin with, and they got to experience that. Good things coming for LSU. I'm very curious how that quarterback situation is going to play out. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. Make sure you like the video, and please subscribe to the channel. Not just for me. That's how we keep this entire thing free.